Hi everyone, a big thank you again for coming along. Before we begin, I'm just going to go over the main topics I'll cover this evening. So the first thing we'll talk about is what is a snapshot. So this will focus on numeracy, but it could be adapted across a range of subjects. Then we'll talk a wee bit about how they work. After that, we'll talk about how that informs my teaching. This is where I'll discuss how I teach numeracy and maths mostly, but again, you could adapt this across lots of subjects, and hopefully you'll take some ideas from this. Fourth thing we'll talk about is snapshots in writing and why they're slightly different. After that, I'll talk about how that informs my teaching of writing. And finally, we'll have a look at some questions. Before I tell you what a snapshot is, let me briefly tell you how they came about. Snapshots were first started by a colleague of mine, Rachel Mansfield, who teaches at Balbardy Primary School in West Lothian, where I worked before. Rachel and her stage partner, also Rachel, were using snapshots across all areas of the curriculum to inform their teaching and assess their primary ones at the time. I was then asked by the head teacher to lead a group looking at assessment, and as part of a small working group, we read John Hattie's book on visible learning. Anyone that's read that book will know about the effect sizes within it. Essentially, it talks about what parts of teaching have the biggest impact on learning. And I personally felt that snapshots could help us target some of the areas which have the biggest impact, allowing us to give targeted feedback to pupils, show our pupils our expectations for their learning, as well as showing them their journey in their own learning. As well as developing a consistent approach to assessment across our school, it would also involve us all working together so we were all doing the same thing. So that was how I started using snapshots, and it's something that I've taken with me to Dunbar Primary, where I work now, and it's the main part of what I'd like to share with you this evening. So, what is a snapshot? A snapshot is an assessment done before and after a block of teaching. This could be 6 to 8 weeks usually, however it could be longer, could be shorter depending on what you're covering. All the questions in a snapshot are aligned to the benchmark statements. Pupils complete the snapshot at their own level. It gives a snapshot of the learning for the teacher and pupil to see their knowledge of a subject before and after, as well as the journey they've gone on. It's not the be-all and end-all, so it's certainly not a case of teach to the test, and doing amazingly or disastrously on a snapshot doesn't define the progress, but it does give you an idea of gaps, strengths, and I've found that usually it backs up my own professional judgment. This is an example snapshot from place value given to a primary 6 class. It's set up in 3 columns, so let me explain that. As it's a primary 6 level snapshot, there's a primary 5 level, which is on the left. In the middle is the primary 6 level questions, and on the right hand side is the primary 7 level questions. This would obviously change depending on what your year stage is. So what I've done is this: I've looked at the benchmarks for place value in the East Lothian signposts and the Highland maths progression, and what I've been able to see is the statements for each year for place value, and I've picked an activity to complete based on each aspect of place value that it suggests. As you can see, all 3 columns have subheadings in bold, which relate to the group of statements being looked at in each year. So all 3 have a set of questions on rounding, place value, decimals, and negative number. The idea is for pupils to complete as much as they can. They don't need to start on the left and work their way to the right, but they can switch columns as they see fit. For example, you might have a pupil who's really confident in rounding, so they complete that in the primary 7 column, but then doesn't understand negative numbers so well, so they complete that in the primary 5 section, whereas they finish the rest of the sections in primary 6. That's absolutely fine. Essentially, the pupils pick out the questions that they feel confident in completing. This could be a lot in the initial snapshot, or it could just be a little. Both are absolutely fine. What this gives you is just a snapshot of the knowledge of the pupil at the time. The next slide is going to show you a completed version of a pupil's first attempt, which I call an initial snapshot. So you can see from this initial snapshot, the pupil has completed most of the rounding in the primary 6 column, so they were reasonably confident they knew about rounding. They've then tried the primary 7 rounding questions, but decided it was too difficult for them and stopped after just one line of the question. They've then completed all the place value task at primary 7 level, meaning they've got a good knowledge of number, but have left the rest of the snapshot blank, which is absolutely fine. This means, if you see this as a consistent pattern across the class, you probably need to teach negative number and decimal as a focus to this class. So this would be where I'd focus my teaching time over the next few weeks. This is the same pupil snapshot taken about 5 weeks later, and you can see she's been able to progress quite a lot. Not only has she completed the whole snapshot this time, but she's completed the snapshot and attempted way more of the primary 7 level questions, completing them accurately. Again, she doesn't need to start from the left and work her way across to the right because she knew where she was in her learning. She's gone from not understanding decimal and negative questions at all to be able to do them. You might also see that she's also done the primary 6 negative number question, but when I mark this, I just mark it at the highest level achieved. So they've gone from not completing much to now being confident to finish the snapshot and complete most of it a year above their current learning, which is exactly what we want. This is how I would mark a snapshot. So on the left hand side, I've got my class list with all the names. And then along the top, I've got the benchmark aspects. The black line down the middle just shows the gap between the initial and the final snapshot. So what I'll do in the initial snapshot is give each pupil a level for each area. So P5, P6, P7, depending on which questions they answered. And then a traffic light colour corresponding to how they did in each aspect. Red would mean they haven't understood at all. Orange would be understood a bit of it, or maybe half. And green would be if a pupil was accurate. I would then do the same after the final snapshot on the other side of the sheet, and then I can see the progression. The final box is just for any notes, and I can see from this marking sheet that I needed to cover negative number again, as this was something that most pupils had scored poorly on. You could obviously adapt this or do it on a spreadsheet on a computer, but I just prefer to have it on paper. Now we know what a snapshot is and how I use it to assess, I'd just like to share with you how that ties into what I do on a daily basis with my class. So what you can see here is a rough structure of how I teach numeracy and maths every day. So we start off with a number game, then we look at some strategies in mental maths by doing a number talk. Then I'll do my teaching input before the pupils complete a task, and we finish off with a plenary. Finally, I'd like to point out that there's no grouping in my classroom. Pupils are free to choose their level of challenge, and I'll explain that a bit more when we get to the task section. So as I said, we usually start with a number game. It's just a chance to get the pupils in the right mind frame. So it could be a game such as Round the World, but usually what I'll do is focus on recapping our last lesson or learning that we've already completed. It's not always a game. Sometimes it could be like things like the odd one out or a challenge of some kind. Usually only spend about 5 minutes or so on this. Next we do a number talk for about 15 minutes. This is where pupils are presented with a certain question, which allows pupils to complete a task and allows discussion around a strategy. I'm currently completing training in cognitive guided instruction numeracy, which builds upon this, and it's about using the types of questions to extract certain strategies from pupils rather than always direct modelling. In the number talk, there are no hands up, and we get some pupils to model their answers, which are put on the maths wall. We all agree what the answer should be, and then we talk about what the most efficient strategy should be for that question as well. Following the number talk, we usually spend 10 minutes or so with me giving my teaching input and explaining the task. This is usually pitched at the middle ability level of my class, as I find the task itself allows people to challenge or support themselves, along with me being free to wander around the room and help and challenge where needed. Here we have an example of the kind of task my primary 6 class might face. As you can see, we've got 3 columns, just like the snapshot, with 3 different titles. We have amazing, which in this example is green, fantastic, which is orange, and brilliant, which is red. This is just really a slight twist on the Chili Challenge and was inspired by a learning session I took part in with Shirley Clark. The 3 different columns are different levels. In the example that we can see, amazing is pitched at about primary 4 or 5, and brilliant is the most challenging, pitched at primary 7. This will depend on your class though and their snapshots. The pupils self-set every day. Their first task in the lesson is to read the questions and decide where they think they are. Sometimes I'll mix up the level of the question underneath each heading. So for example, amazing could have the hardest set of problems under it, or fantastic might have the easiest set of problems under it. This is just to stop the pupils kind of sticking with one colour and encourages them to actually read and reflect on what they're doing. As well as that, I think that it allows them to think more deeply about what they did last time and how that relates to the lesson they're doing today. Once the pupils have picked their level, they write it in their jotters, and they just write their title as the heading that they've picked, so amazing, fantastic or brilliant. The questions will be in the same colour as the example you can see, even if they're moved around, but I'll mark them in the colour that I know that they're doing. So if I've mixed them up and made amazing the hardest set of problems, even though it's green on the board, I'll mark it in red. This just shows progression in their jota and allows me to give extra challenge to those who've been successful and support those who are struggling. As we can see exactly where pupils have started and ended a block of teaching. What I'm going to talk about now is snapshots in writing, because that's done slightly differently. The idea is, though, to have your block of writing used to assess all areas of literacy. The idea for this comes mostly from Lee Parkinson, who you will probably know as Mr. P on social media, and his Read, Write, Perform packs, well worth checking out if you get a chance. So this is something I came across after really struggling to teach writing as a probationer, and it's an approach that I now use across all my writing teaching. Start off each block with a benchmark, which is really just the initial snapshot. In the next lesson, we look at a good example, so what the pupil should be aiming to complete by the end of the block. We do this by reading and watching and creating questions, which allows you as the teacher to model comprehension skills. We then explore and compare two further good examples, which allows the pupils to then use the comprehension skills you've taught in the last lesson. The lesson after this, we complete a magpie session where we take ideas from the good examples and look how we can use it in our own writing. And then we develop some writing skills, which we'll be doing throughout the weeks as we go along anyway, culminating in a shared write, which we do as a class. Finally, pupils will take all their learning and redraft their initial benchmark, inputting everything that they've learned and picked up before assessing talking and listening by bringing their writing to life by performing it. The benchmark is where you can assess what pupils can do for a particular style of writing. The idea is to hook the pupils in with something they can relate to, whether that's a real life issue or something related to what you're learning in class. It's important to also explain why writing is important, because it's linked to all the areas of literacy. I often say to my class that it's not just a task for school, it's about connecting and getting out a message. For example, every YouTuber or filmmaker has had to start with a storyboard and a script, which is just another form of writing. I'd also like to stress that the benchmark is not a cold write, but you do need to allow pupils to express their own ideas at this stage. Don't give a set of rules. Allow them to do what they think is right for the context you're looking at. Some examples of things I've done are when we did World War II, we did an imagined personal response from an evacuee. When we wrote informative text, we created a tourist guide to Edinburgh, which we made into a filmed advert. And when we did report writing, we did about an alien spaceship landing in the playground, and we created a Reporting Scotland style newscast to go with our newspapers. The next step would be to look at a final example, so basically what the pupils are aiming for with their performance. This could also be your chance to win your first Oscar too. But there we are. Before showing any video, it's important to give the pupils a chance to read the text by themselves first and then with a partner, and talk about how they think it will sound and who will be speaking. This rehearsal allows the pupils to become familiar with the text before they see it. It also helps you explore and assess their level of understanding of what they've just read. Following watching or reading the good example, we would usually then have a class discussion about what we thought and what makes it a good example before the pupils can then ask me questions about the text. We'll discuss different types of questions you could have, and then as a group they can write down their own questions. This allows me to model how to answer the questions using clues from the text itself. Pupils need to understand that they must refer back to the text when answering so they can explain that they understand what they've read. The next stage is to compare, so basically applying the reading skills that you've modelled. You should pick at least 2 good examples related to what you're teaching, and this can be from film, TV, music, books. A good place that I often look for text is literacywaggle.com. And after each example, we discuss the text and then we answer some comprehension questions on each one. So basically using the skills and applying what you've modelled in the last lesson. The next kind of section talks about teaching writing skills of grammar and VCOP, and I do this mostly in 2 small separate lessons out with my writing lessons every week. The first one of these is when we look at something called exciting sentences. This is based on Alan Peate's work on exciting sentences, which comes in a handy app you can download. I would really suggest that you download it. It breaks down about 50 sentence types into different genres that you could use to make your own writing more exciting. So what we do is each week we study one sentence type. It will be one that the pupils can use in the block of writing we're studying though. And we explore the rules of the sentence, i.e. the punctuation and the types of words used before we create an example as a class. The pupils will then think, pair, share with a partner before independently writing their own sentence, which follows the exciting sentences rule. The winning 2 sentences are displayed on our classroom wall each week, and I have to say the pupils really engage with this and usually all want to share their sentences. The idea of this is just to drip feed in what they need before they come to redrafting their own writing. The second thing I use weekly is this wonderful resource by Andrew Jennings, Vocabulary Ninja. He's also made books called Comprehension Ninja, which we also use in class weekly. However, the Ninja book talks about how we should expand children's knowledge of vocab and how it helps with everyday activities, including writing. So we will have 2 words of the week each week. They're always part of the pupils' morning challenge. There's 2 levels of words, grasshopper, which is slightly easier, and shinobi, which is slightly harder. And the pupils will explore different things about the words such as synonyms, prefixes, suffixes, word types, etymology, and that's all part of the morning challenge. The pupils will then have a short lesson on Friday where they complete a task using the words, and the words are then displayed on our vocab wall, which give the pupils a large word bank of ambitious vocab they can access at any time they need it. The next part of the lessons would be to magpie. This is where you re-watch your 3 or 4 good examples and pupils have a chance to write down phrases, sentences and words that they would like to borrow or magpie to use in their own writing. Along this, we'll do a shared write as a class where I talk about what I would do if I was a pupil writing this piece. I'll try and include exciting sentences and I could use words of the day and I try and drop in my magpie ideas as well as take on ideas from the pupils. This is just to give the class a whole set of tools that they might want to use rather than rules that they have to follow. Sometimes what happens in these sessions is we do a detailed plan together and then each table gets a different section of the piece to write and then they have to bring it all together first as a table and then as a class. This part is more about giving pupils lots of exposure to good examples and then again modelling good writing skills. Then, after a week or 2 of exploring the text using reading skills and developing the author's craft, pupils revisit their initial benchmark. Pupils use this as their basis for their final snapshot. The idea is to input everything they've learned and up-level the initial piece of writing. For some pupils, this will take a lot of tweaking, and for others, it just takes some fine-tuning. But what is great is, by the end of the lesson, pupils can see just by flicking through their book just how much they've improved from their initial benchmark to their final piece. The final stage is to perform the writing. This is to show that writing has a real-life purpose. It's not just done in school, it's done for a reason. It's also a great opportunity to use technology to bring to life what you've written, depending on what you have available to you, as well as assess talking and listening. I'm often amazed how pupils who find the writing part tricky can excel at making their piece come to life. In the past, I've used apps such as Green Screen, Chatterpix, Adobe Spark, Animate Everything, Google Sites, as well as loads of other things. If you'd like to see some examples, just scroll through my Twitter feed. So there we are. That's snapshots. I hope you've picked up at least one thing you could try with your class. To recap, a snapshot is done at the start and the end of each teaching block. It gives you information to challenge and support learners, and informs your professional judgment. It helps pupils see their progress, which in turn motivates them to want to learn more. And finally, I hope you can see how this could be used across all levels and curricular areas, as well as giving you a chance to work with colleagues and stage partners to develop the snapshots themselves. Finally, a big thank you all for coming along. If you've got any questions, feel free to ask and I'll try my best to answer. And if you'd like to share ideas or need help with anything, feel free to follow me on social media. Thank you very much.